Chapter 28, Analysis of Final Accounts, or Ratio Analysis. In class, we covered some of the ratios already. So we looked at what the rate of stock turnover is, and where we looked at the average stock, where you had opening stock plus closing stock divided by 2. We went on to look at profitability ratios, so our net profit percentage on our gross profit percentage. And in this video, we're going to be looking at our liquidity ratios, and in particular, the working capital ratio and the acid test ratio. So you can follow me in the book, and as we're going along, there are some pages in the workbook that can be tried. What I will do is, once we're finished the chapter, I will do a video on correcting the workbook and the end of chapter questions. But for now, we're going to be looking at the different ratios. As I said, we looked at the rate of stock turnover formula, where you had the cost of sales over average stock, and the profitability ratios were there's looking at gross profit and net profit, dividing both by sales, multiplying by 100 to get your percentage. Now we're going to look at liquidity ratios. And in particular, looking at liquidity is looking at your current assets to current liabilities. So how much cash you have or assets that can be quickly converted to cash that you have to any liabilities. And remember, current looks at here and now, so within 1 year, or even within the month. So they're not long-term assets or long-term liabilities. Whereas when we talk about solvency, we're looking at the long-term how the business is going to operate if it can keep working. So liquidity is all about being able to pay current debt. Solvency is long-term. The business is it solvent? Can it keep operating? So the first ratio we look at is the working capital ratio. Why it's called the working capital ratio is because of looking at the figures, the current assets to current liabilities. And if you can remember back to your final accounts, your trading profit and loss and balance sheet, in particular the balance sheet or the statement of financial position. I'm just going to get an example of one here in the previous chapter. So the balance sheet, if you can remember, we had current assets, current liabilities, and financed by. Now it's a bit slow to load here, so we'll just wait. Okay, so your balance sheet, here is an example of one here, where you have your fixed assets. These are your long-term assets. So if you have buildings, equipment, or delivery vans, they're quite expensive assets. If you have them, it'll take a bit of time to try and sell them off and convert to cash to pay your debts. So they're not calculated in the working capital ratio. It's looking at the headings of current assets and current liabilities. Current liabilities. The finance by is more your long-term liabilities. So all this area here and this area here would be compared. So the long-term assets to long-term liabilities is looking at an overall picture of how the business is doing. Whereas here for the current assets and current liabilities, we're just going to focus in on here and now. The current, if you think about stock, can be converted quickly to cash if you sell it or you go to the bank to get your money. So that 60,560 is available quite quickly. The bank overdraft is owed, and that would have to be covered quickly with the 60,560. But there will be a working capital left over in this example of 37,710. So the working capital is good, and that's why it's called the working capital ratio. How much money is left over once current liabilities are paid with the current assets. And there are the two figures that would be compared, current assets to current liabilities. So how much in current assets have you available as a business to pay back your current liabilities or debts? And the working capital is the figure used really. But it's done like a ratio. You compare the two, divide one into the other, and put it is to 1, as you'll see here on the example in this chapter here. So working capital ratio, the formula is current assets to current liabilities. It can also be called the asset test or quick ratio. So it's a test to see how the business can quickly convert their assets into cash. Formula for asset test ratio is your current assets. I suppose here more so we're looking at a truer reflection of how the business can pay back their debts. So it's taking out closing stock, because closing stock is harder to sell. So we looked at the example in the last chapter about having to sell stock or go to the bank to get the money. So current assets, where you have money in cash or in the bank, it's a lot easier to see, can you pay back your debts if you take out closing stock. So there's two different formulas for liquidity. One is the working capital ratio, which is all your assets, including closing stock, compared to all your current liabilities, current assets to current liabilities. Whereas your asset test or your quick ratio just takes out the closing stock for a truer reflection, but you're still comparing your current assets to current liabilities. But because the closing stock is taken out, the I suppose the norm or the best figure to compare to is where you have a ratio of 1:1. So for every €1 that you owe in liabilities, you have €1 to pay it back. So they match, and that's good. Whereas here on the working capital, you should have €2 available for every €1 that you owe. If you think about it, this is including your your closing stock. So the norm or the ideal, as they call it here, is bigger. So the two different ratios, they're very similar. Working capital ratio, current assets divided by current liabilities. The formula would be an answer is, maybe it's 2:1, and that'd be €2 available for every €1 that you owe, which is fine. That's good. Anything above that is great. Anything below that is not good. Here for the asset test ratio, once you take out closing stock, the norm or the ideal is €1 for every €1 that you owe. You have €1 to cover it. Anything above that is great. Anything below that is not good. So some examples there in the book of different years, so you could compare one year to the next. So in the next video, we'll look at some examples.